Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit, the newest and most reliable state-of-the-art time-traveling transportation service, is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Odyssey.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the podcast. This week, I was unbelievably excited to speak with Dr. Christian Casey, who is the CLIR Postdoctoral Fellow of Digital Humanities at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. His research focuses on the use of digital tools to expand our understanding of the pronunciation of the Egyptian language. His work also includes numerous digital projects for the ISAW Library and several public outreach initiatives designed to make the study of ancient Egyptian accessible to a broader and more diverse audience. I really got to let my inner armchair literary Egyptologist run wild as we discussed all things Egypt, including the survival of the field of Egyptology, whether accuracy matters in the representation of the ancient world in the media, and about the use of video games as a language learning tool. This was such a fun conversation, and I can't wait for you all to hear it. So with that, I will talk to you all next time. Okay, so I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about sort of what got you into Egyptology, just because it is a very niche subject that a lot of people aren't aware of.
Yeah, it's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a really cool answer for it. I've been thinking for a long time that I need to invent like one of these great like road to Damascus stories that many Egyptologists have, where they like remember being 3 years old and they went to the Met and they were like, there is nothing so beautiful and fascinating as ancient Egypt. That's not my story, unfortunately. I have always loved ancient Egypt, and I have distinct memories from being a kid and being fascinated with Egyptian things. But the reason that I got into Egyptology and decided to pursue it is that I've always been interested in ancient languages, and I studied classics at UT Austin. And I don't even remember exactly where or when, but I think I was in the Classics Lounge, which anyone who has done anything with UT Classics will immediately have an image of this place. There's this great room at the end of one of the halls that just has like a big table in it, and classic students hang out in there. And this is very like old school, like professorial study. There's like a bust of Cicero and other like random things in there. It's kind of like Merlin's tower in The Sword and the Stone. So I was in there one day and someone had a book about Egyptian. I think it was Gardner's Egyptian language. And I looked through it and you know, as an undergrad, you tend to have time to explore different things. So I ended up just taking it home and reading about it. And I became absolutely fascinated for a few reasons. One reason is that the hieroglyphic signs don't stop being pictures of things, which is, I need a better way to explain that. Let's see. So if you were to look at a text of English, written English, because you know how to read the alphabet, you can't really conceive of not being able to read it. You can't really just see it as a page full of black squiggly shapes anymore. Whereas if you looked at some script you don't know, so in my case, I might look at a page full of Chinese text, which to me, my brain interprets it as a bunch of random shapes that don't mean anything to me. With Egyptian, you kind of get both at the same time. So even if you know how to read it exactly, you never stop seeing the pictures of like birds and people and stuff. So it kind of has this magical dual quality where it's perfectly legible as text, and yet at the same time, it's still a piece of art. I'm just absolutely in love with the whole thing. I love Egyptian art. I love their sense of proportion and their aesthetic approach. I love that they are keen observers of nature. So their depictions of the natural world are normally almost photorealistic sometimes within their, the Egyptian canonical proportional system. And that just, I think that's the biggest thing. If I could pick one reason that I became an Egyptologist, it's that the ancient Egyptians were keen observers of nature in the same way that like Louis Henry Sullivan based his architectural ornamentation on his own fascination with nature. And that's where the whole like modernist mantra of form follows function comes from. It's, we evolved in a natural environment where most things are built the way they are for practical reasons. So like, evolution sculpts things to be functional or tends to discard them. And so as a result, we tend to find things constructed in that way to be the most aesthetically pleasing things. So any artistic system that places observation of nature at its center will be better. Like I would say objectively, but maybe just subjectively for me. It has an attraction that really nothing else can compete with.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I always loved Egypt so much. I loved everything about it, probably since sixth grade. But for me, it was the result of an amazing teacher. It was just a random, normal sixth grade class where most people are like, okay, well, if I've got to learn something, whatever, I'll just get through it. And that's that. My teacher made it really interactive where we got to our like Egypt unit. And then she was sort of like, oh, you can all pick Egyptian names. I'm going to make each table an ancient Egyptian city. We'll have competitions doing quote unquote things that ancient Egyptians did. And I just remember that whole unit. I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And then she would, tell us, and she was really great at reading in a really dramatic fashion. So if you can imagine for a second, this like super funny with a ridiculous laugh, wonderful short teacher just kind of getting up and standing in front of a class of, you're what, 10, 11 at that age, and just going at it. She was like an actress. It was amazing. And she would read Egyptian myths. And I just was like, oh my God, I have to do this. But I think it's really easy for people to find something that, draws them into Egypt that they love. But it's not easy when you want to go on and, study that. So how did you transfer this just intense interest into Egyptology is an actual subject that I can study? Like, did you know about it, that it was a actual discipline that you could study, or did you kind of go towards something hoping you could study Egyptology, and then did someone have to be like, actually, did you know Egyptology is a thing?
I think it was probably a little bit of both. I definitely didn't think of an Egyptologist as like a real job that I could go out and get until I was an undergrad and started learning about kind of what academics do. I remember being stunned as an undergrad to learn that academics write papers. I always thought that was it still to me seems a little strange that you just like sit around and write about things. Don't you like teach people stuff? Not that much, truthfully. So I kind of got my introduction to that whole academic system as an undergrad. I had a friend who was a grad student. He was the teacher in one of my Latin classes as a grad student. He lived across the street from me in Austin. And I talked with him a lot, and he kind of explained how things worked. Like, if you want to become an Egyptologist or a classicist or whatever, you'll need to apply to grad school. You should be funded through grad school. If you're not being funded, you shouldn't do it. So they should basically pay you to get your PhD. And you need to, pick the place where you want to go, talk to the people who are, working there already, find out if it's the right place for you. So as an undergrad in my senior year, I went to the RC conference in Seattle, and I got like funding from my department to go. So that was really cool. And met a bunch of Egyptologists. And I think my first realization, it echoes Douglas Adams's realization when he went to a scientific conference and met all the scientists, and he was like, you're just a bunch of guys. And that was kind of my reaction too. Guys and ladies, of course, especially in Egyptology, tends to be less male dominated than some fields, although still problematically. So anyway, it was kind of that realization of like, you're just a bunch of normal people. I can totally do this. I'm not a super genius, but I don't think all of you are either. I think it's just, I think I can do it. So then I went and after I finished undergrad, I volunteered on a kibbutz in order to learn Hebrew, although that didn't really pan out because everyone on my kibbutz spoke in English all the time. And then I moved to Egypt, and I worked as an English teacher in Egypt for a couple years. And then I moved to Peru, and then I applied to grad school. So I think that was a big part of it, was that I went and learned Egyptian Arabic. At the time that I left Egypt, I was just kind of, freewheeling around and traveling and, just hanging out. And I spoke Egyptian Arabic more or less fluently at the time. Although I've since, unfortunately, lost a lot of my knowledge of it because I just never really have an opportunity to use it. But so then when I applied to grad school, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on an Egyptian text. I studied with a classics professor who also just shared an interest in ancient Egypt. And we worked on, Egyptian language and hieratic and all those things. And then I went and lived in Egypt. And I think all of those things allowed me to have a competitive application to grad school. And that's kind of where it went from there, was going to grad school at Brown. Brown was far and away my top choice because I wanted to work with Jim Allen. Definitely one of the best decisions I've ever made. Jim is, obviously I'm biased, but he's one of my favorite people in the whole world. He's the most wonderful contradiction of a grumpy grandpa you've ever met, in a way that is just like, it never stops being delightful. Like, people often mistakenly think that he's mean because he's just very curmudgeonly, but he's actually like the kindest person you've ever met in your life. But he also just has this grumpy disposition. So he's like the sweetest guy in the world, but he's always just like, it just warms my heart every time I interact with him. And yeah, that's really, so I think if I give anyone credit for me managing to become an Egyptologist, it definitely goes to Jim Allen. He lived in Egypt for a time, so we were able to, kind of break the ice over, shared experience and those kind of things. And just went from there. Taught me a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's super awesome. I love hearing about everyone's different path into whatever ancient field they got into. Just because, there is there are so many people today that we can meet who, they went to college for math or biochemistry or something, just sort of more, I don't want to say, more well-known, really. And, I think one of the biggest things that I really like to, dig into and hear about is, I feel like such a barrier to entry for any of these fields is just the lack of accessibility of them.
Oh yeah.
Because I got lucky. I don't remember who it was, but somebody, when I was younger, I was maybe in 7th or 8th grade, but somebody knew Egyptology was an actual field of study, and they happened to mention it to me, and they were like, "Oh, we know you love Egypt. You should think about doing this. You should think about, what can you do in high school to prepare you to go into Egyptology?" And sort of things kind of fell into place, and then I just had a great conversation with Steve Harvey, the Egyptologist.
I know Steve. Yeah, I know I met him at my first RC conference.
Yeah, so I think like a neighbor's friend, he was like the uncle of a neighbor's friend or something. It was so weird, but somehow
he knows
stars
everyone on Earth, so it's not surprising to me.
Okay, yeah. So no, it was great because I got to talk to him, and then he advised me and he sent me a couple emails, and he was like, "Yeah, if you want to be an Egyptologist, you got to do X, Y, and Z. You're only going into high school, so you have lots of time." And then when it came time to like looking at colleges, I sort of stopped and said, "Ooh, so my choices are essentially Brown, Harvard, Hopkins, UCLA, Memphis, some other elite institutions." And I said, "Wow, this is gonna be really hard." For my whole life, I've struggled with like math and science. So I just knew, I was like, I'm going to have trouble getting into these. So then that really discouraged me. And I said, I'll get into somewhere and hope that they have a bunch of Egypt classes that I can cobble together and maybe create my own major. That didn't happen. I ended up going to the University of Missouri, and I fell into classics, which was a wonderful landing spot. And I love it. And I love everyone who helped me. But, I didn't get to do that, even though that was kind of my first ancient love. So, do you feel that it's still kind of a problem that it's so hard to get into these programs?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that I'm really passionate about is addressing that issue. It's probably the thing I spend most of my time on in one way or another, actually. So it is the case that, Egyptology is almost always relegated to these like very elite institutions that are super expensive, super exclusive. And it creates a problem from the perspective of Egyptology, because it means that we can't actually recruit. And maybe recruit's a little tough a word, but for any field to survive, there has to be a next generation, right? For anything to survive, there has to be a next generation. And Egyptology definitely has some trouble with that. While everyone loves the subject, finding people who will actually, who are willing to go work in the subject is not as easy as you might think. And a big part of the reason is just that it's so exclusive. It's so tied to these universities. A big part of the reason for that is that historically, Egyptology has been associated with aristocracy. So from the first era of Egyptomania in Europe, following Napoleon's expedition at the end of the 18th century. So for the 1800s, Egyptomania was a major thing in Europe. Mummy unwrappings and those sorts of things. And then beginning in the 20th century, Egypt was a destination for wealthy people, both as tourists and also for health reasons. So, in the days before antibiotics, a lot of people with lung ailments would spend their winters in Egypt because of the warm, dry climate. So that created a patronage system where people like Jack Morgan, is it Jack? J.P. Morgan Jr. He had some sort of ailment, spent his winters in Egypt, and then collected manuscripts and left his house and part of his estate to found the Morgan Library in New York. And that's kind of the system of support that Egyptology has relied on for all of its history. People like J.P. Morgan Jr., who was one of the richest men in the history of the world, becoming interested in the subject and just kind of dumping huge amounts of money into it. And then, of course, that's why it ends up at elite institutions, because if you are a multi-billionaire and you're spending money, you probably are going to spend it at a place that provides a sense of personal prestige and all those things. So Egyptology really has to move away from that model in order to survive. There are no more aristocrats wintering in Egypt. That's a thing of the past. Colonialism is not entirely a thing of the past, but it's definitely, we are not engaging in those practices to the same level that we once were, thankfully. But it also, for better or worse, was a source of support for the academic study of Egyptology. There's some good things about that. The brightest light that I see in the current state of Egyptology is that there is so much more involvement from Egyptians. The most recent Netflix documentary, there are Egyptian archaeologists, and I mean like people who are Egyptian, who are archaeologists, speaking in Egyptian Arabic, with subtitles, and it's actually being conducted on Egyptian terms. That's one of the best things that's come out of this. The change of history. But maintaining support for the academic study of Egyptology is still going to depend on, attracting interesting students in Western countries. And sorry, did I say interesting students? Interesting students for sure, but also interested students in Western countries. That's inevitably a part of maintaining the field. So it's something that we have to reckon with. I think if I can be a bit controversial, I'll go ahead and say that the reason that it hasn't been dealt with yet is that many academics kind of see themselves as heirs to this aristocratic tradition and kind of look down their nose at public outreach and things like that. So that's something that has to change. I think it's not true in my generation anymore, so that's something that is changing. And yeah, and we have to make these things accessible just because, well, the way I see it is I have been very privileged to, get paid to study at this elite university and get to spend my time doing these things that I'm really interested in. Not everyone is so lucky. We live in a world where people have to work for a living, and most people have to work doing things that they don't like. And I feel a sense of obligation to them because of our shared humanity to make this information available to whoever's interested in it, right? If you have to wash dishes for a living, but you're interested in Egyptology, you should get to learn about Egyptology when you can. We should not set up artificial barriers to entry. So that's something I'm doing with my online classes. So the things you mentioned, the SASA things, that's SASA's mission as well. That's why I participate in those things. So we've done a few live streams and interviews. I'm also teaching a free online introductory Coptic course. It's open to anyone who's interested in participating. Maybe we can include a link in this at some point, and you can
I can
sign up
definitely
for it.
drop them in the show notes.
Cool. So we're in lesson 7 or 8 now, but you're welcome to join in. I'll help you get caught up. And
Yeah, no, because definitely, even if I went into classics, sometimes I'll go back to my original love and say, well, I'll be an armchair literary Egyptologist, just to critique things from when I read them, because I have quite a small but decent, I would think, library of Egyptology books kind of just over on my bookshelf that I turn to and enjoy whenever I just kind of feel bored, or I'm like, I just need a good dose of everything Egyptian right now. So that's always fun. So so there's the accessibility issue on the collegiate level and the grander level. In terms of bringing it to more young people, say high school or even younger even, I was just wondering, I was just very curious, are there any ways you can see bringing a less scholarly, intense version of Egyptology to younger kids to get them interested and sort of put them on that path where they can then go through high school or whatever and be like, oh yes, I was so interested, I love this, and I do want to continue on it. Because I know
so
that there are just so many different ways to do that. So, there's no one right way, but
there's not one right way. That's something that I thought a lot about, and I came up with a way. And you've unfortunately, you've provided the perfect setup for me to plug my book that I'm writing. So I'm writing a middle grade to young adult, so designed for the ages of 10 to 13. I'm writing a fiction book that's set in a sort of ancient Egyptian world with ancient Egyptian magic, and magic is real, and of course all that kind of stuff, and Egyptian gods are real, and all those kind of things. So that was my approach, was to write fiction that conveys a sense of place that you could only otherwise acquire by doing a PhD program, right? I have a really good sense of what ancient Egyptian society was like and what things would have looked like to the average person on the average day. But I acquired that through reading lots of long, dry, boring things. And so I wanted to find a way to convey that and kind of make it fun. So I invented this semi-fictional world based on the world of late period Egypt, and populated it with cast of characters, and there's a story. I think the story is pretty good. I'm still working on it. I'm about, how far am I? I'm more than 3/4 done with the first draft of the manuscript, and I have a sample first chapter online that people can go read if they're interested. So that's one approach. One approach was to write a fiction book designed for younger audiences, that would kind of convey the magic and mystery of ancient Egypt, while also containing real information. It's all the names are in Egyptian, properly vocalized and everything, because that's what I'm interested in. All the magic spells are in Egyptian, of course. But what else could there be? What else could we do to attract younger people?
I mean, there's always the question of accuracy, but for me, I think I was at quite a young age. The So Rick Riordan obviously is known more for his
Yep.
Percy Jackson series, but he does have his Egyptian series. It's 3 books,
King
not 5,
Chronicles. Yeah,
which are fantastic, and I love them, and I would recommend anyone read them.
me too.
But you know, I grew up in a time, I was born in the 90s, so they definitely were not written. So I did not have access to them, and I did not have access to a lot of the current games and things that we have now. But now that we do have them, would it I don't know if they're too violent or it's too real. I don't know what parents say these days. Not a parent, but I love watching things like the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra and other things that give it a sense of the scale, the grandeur. Obviously, it's not the most accurate ever. Some of the period costumes I take issue with, but when you see her kind of coming into Rome on that giant platform that's golden with like a rotating thing that didn't exist back then, I still would have been like, oh, this is so cool. I want to do that. So could we maybe flood young kids with more media as an approach?
Yeah, I think I think Egyptomania is just fine. So, this question of accuracy, it always comes up. It comes up when we're talking about Assassin's Creed. It comes up whenever you're talking about anything that has a connection to an academic subject. It comes up when we're talking about shows like House MD. Med students will talk about how accurate it was, and that's a check in the pro column for that show, right? I kind of dispute that a little bit. I mean, history is always constructed, no matter how accurate. There is this element of point of view and bias and perspective and context, and all of those things come into play. I don't think so for me personally, I find the experience of writing fiction almost identical to that of writing academic papers, except that you use a different tone in your speech, you use a storytelling tone, and I don't have to cite any sources. So it's really not all that different. I'm filling in the gaps in a way that is the most logical I can come up with based on what I have at the time. I'm normally trying to show my work. So I'm trying to show what is known and what I'm filling in. So really the question of accuracy, it's more of a variable, kind of a continuous value than it is this binary value of like it's accurate or it's not. I think accuracy really doesn't matter at all for attracting people to the field. I think it's in that case totally irrelevant. So the things that you see, if you go to an old like Art Deco movie theater in the United States, everything is wrong about that. The proportions of everything is wrong. The proportions are wrong. The gods are mislabeled, or the hieroglyphs are just totally made up scribble scrabble, and it doesn't matter, because if that inspires in you a love for all things Egyptian, for one thing, at first you don't know that it's out of proportion because you haven't spent hundreds of hours staring at real Egyptian art, and secondly, you can always change what you once knew. This is something that I try to tell my students all the time. I have students worrying about, oh, am I pronouncing this correctly right now? And I always try to tell them, like, no, but you don't have to pronounce it that way forever, right? You're under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago. You can pronounce it wrong now, and we can focus on this one thing. And then later, once you get better at it, you can pronounce it correctly, and it's fine. So I think the obsession with getting things right all the time is definitely the prerogative of older academics who know a subject so well, and who have spent so many hundreds of hours studying it that they would never get certain things wrong. And then they tend to kind of project that expectation onto other people. And I think it's counterproductive. It's accuracy is not important when you're starting out. Starting out is important when you're starting out.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because when people are younger, at least, I know we tend to like accuracy, quote unquote, just to be, oh, I want it to be real. I want it to be right. But when you're that age, I also think you're not as interested in getting things right, because you're like, well, I just I'm not a scholar, I'm a kid, and I just want something that's cool that'll draw me in, pick my attention, and if I want it to be right, they can do more research later and then be presumably corrected. But I just want to circle back to using video games like Assassin's Creed Origins in the educational setting. Because I know that when I watched the sort of video you did on archaeogaming, I noticed a lot of people were asking, well, it may not be accurate, but it's still a good tool. So it kind of comes back to, is it the kind of tool that you would want to assign to students in a class to learn, or to see, okay, well, we're talking about these settings, we're talking about the landscape, the topography, we're talking about architecture. It's one thing to point them to a book and just say, okay, go look at a picture, versus being able to sort of physically interact with it.
Yeah, the physical interaction is super important. And so to answer your overarching question of overarching, I always get that wrong. To answer your main question of is this an educational tool that you would recommend to students? I would say absolutely it is. I think it teaches things that are very difficult to learn from books. And I'll just use one example of this. So in the main map for Assassin's Creed Origins, there are all these major sites in Egypt, and they're sort of like loosely to a real human scale, but then they're all much closer to each other. So you kind of have this like Epcot version of ancient Egypt, where it's like all these different places are just placed much closer to one another so that you can quickly go from one to the next. That's not accurate. That's not how the reality on the ground is. But you can correct that, right? You can take someone who's played up through all of Assassin's Creed Origins and knows the exact layout of the map in the game. And you can say, okay, it's like that in real life, but everything's farther apart. They just squished it together for the game. And there you go. They now know the entire geography of ancient Egypt. Now try to go in the other direction, take someone who hasn't played Assassin's Creed Origins and give them a map of ancient Egypt and tell them to memorize it. Good luck ever completing that task. I've tried myself, and I never could focus enough to actually like go all the way through like Baines and Melek and like really learn all of the little tiny places and all the names of the gnomes and that kind of stuff, because it's boring. It's if you interact with something, you remember it better. And if the thing you interact with is a little bit wrong, it only really takes one minor correction to totally set it right and give you a complete picture of the real thing that you're supposed to be learning.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree, just because I have played it and I have used it. And I mean, I've done, I would say, probably more background research than a lot of my friends, so I would kind of know what to look for. But even the stuff that I didn't, I was like, oh, this is so great. And I can learn the geography and be like, well, it's over here, maybe not as short as it is, but it's there. And so it definitely helps for retention of information, just because you're interacting with it for many hours. But yeah, also just in terms of like, I don't think it was as much of an issue in Odyssey, just because it's a little easier, a little more recent. But I was thinking of, because I also read your paper on using video games like Origins as a digital tool for all different kinds of education. In terms of teaching language, I was just kind of curious, because in Odyssey, they're speaking Greek. They have Greek language in there, so that's whatever. But I know that the Egyptian kind of leaves a little to be desired. So is that kind of just something you would say, well, didn't really do the best in that, so I wouldn't sort of recommend this for the language part?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend the language as like a source of learning about Egyptian language. It's the one thing that I tend to criticize, because I feel like it's a place where they got a little lazy, honestly. So they did such great work on that game, and I have almost nothing but praise for it. So I want to preface this with that every time, because I don't want to seem like I'm being overly critical. They did a wonderful job, but in the specific area of language, they kind of phoned it in a little bit. They collected some Egyptian phrases, they sent them to the audio guy. The audio guy had people read things into a microphone and splice them together and made kind of Egyptian sounding stuff. And even the Egyptian phrases, they didn't do very well, because of course the game's taking place in the year, what was it, 59 BC, something like that, first century BC, and we know what the language would have sounded like at that time, because of course that's very near in time to Coptic, which we know how to speak. So we know what Egyptian would have sounded like. We know the kinds of things people would have said, and those could have easily been used. I think whoever made those decisions about Egyptian language kind of went for the default Middle Egyptian, which is actually 2,000 years too old for this setting. And they just did it because it was the easiest, most accessible thing. And that goes back to this problem of accessibility, where we as Egyptologists have really not done a good job of kind of painting the full picture of this huge world for people. I mean, the timescales that we're talking about, the timescale that I just telescoped to say, hey, they could use Coptic in Assassin's Creed Origins because they're close enough in time. That's twice the age of the United States. And I just collapsed that time span. When we're talking about Middle Egyptian, it's the distance between us and Cleopatra. That's the amount of time they telescoped. This thing that we're studying is just almost unimaginably or incomprehensibly huge. And we're not always conveying that. We tend to telescope it and see it as kind of this monolithic thing. And yeah, we could do better.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that just because, it occurred to me that sometimes I go around and I say funny things from Odyssey, and it can also teach you to use words that maybe you shouldn't probably use. A common feature was always,
what's the word he says, like Malacca or something?
Yeah, Malacca, which you shouldn't use. I mean, I don't know.
I'm sure I just said something very offensive. I'm sorry, any Greek listeners.
Yeah. So, because I thought it was so funny, just because of the fact that I thought it was like, oh, that just must kind of be code for fuck or something, just really the ancient way of swearing really easily, just because whatever. And then I talked to my Greek friend, and she was like, no, that's a really, really rude word. You shouldn't use, never call somebody that. And then, when I asked, well, okay, then who uses it if it's that bad? And she said, well, I guess really, really close friends can call each other that, because it's like a term of endearment or something.
What does it mean? Is it like son of a bitch or something?
I think they said it's like the equivalent of calling someone like a wanker, like go fuck yourself, like buggery or something. I forgot exactly how she explained it to me, but it was basically implying that you were going to go have sex with, I don't know. It was something really rude. And I was like, okay, well, I will not say that or call someone that. But, it's funny because I learned that by talking to a Greek friend. And then when I interact with a lot of the fan base, it's Malacca, 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 this, that, and the other thing. And they use it so flippantly. And I'm like, if you knew what you were saying. And I was like, what happens if they all go to Greece because of this game? And then they start using that word with Greek people. I was like, you have no idea the damage that this could do.
I wonder, I wish we could, I know some Greek people, actually. I can ask them whether they've noticed an increase in the usage of that word. Especially by foreigners. That'd be kind of funny if there's like now this plague of like this horrifically rude language because of the video game.
I would find that really interesting. So if you do ask, I'd be very interested to know.
I'm totally gonna ask. Yeah.
Just because I also made mistakes. So I started modern Greek after graduating school because I wanted to go do my grad work in Greece at the University of Athens. And so I said, okay, well, I'm gonna learn to speak Greek. And so I started learning, and then when we were learning basic terms for like families because of the game, I was like, oh, isn't it like mater and pater, which is what they use in the game? And my Greek teacher was like, no, that's like a Romanized Greeky mix that's just really bad and not used. So don't do that. And I was like, I had no idea that's what they didn't call them. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, they're not that far off. It's just metera and pateras, which isn't that far, but still it's wrong. And I wouldn't know that if I wasn't taking Greek. So sometimes I'm like, this could just do the opposite. This could really do some damage from the language perspective. And especially, I kind of find it interesting how I would appreciate some kind of language disclaimer, like, hi, we're creating a mix-up of real and sort of fake language. Don't take this as the real thing, because it could get you into trouble. That's just something I've kind of found.
I mean, accidentally swearing at someone, especially as a foreigner, could definitely get you into trouble. But also, it is not that likely. Like in my experiences, traveling a lot and spending a lot of time abroad, I've had plenty of moments where I said the wrong thing. I think my favorite example, let me see, is probably from Spanish, when in Spain, I ordered like a coño of ice cream instead of a cono of ice cream. And like one of them is essentially the word cunt, and the other one is the word cone. And the lady making the ice cream just like lost it for a second and had to like recompose herself and hand it to me. You're probably not going to get in a fist fight over accidentally saying a bad word in a foreign language, but it would be nice if it were all correct, because the experience of 100%ing a game like Assassin's Creed is hearing a lot of the NPC dialogue over and over and over again, to the point where it's just kind of burned in your memory. And if it were correct, that would be an incredibly effective language learning tool. So I think that's my biggest complaint, is the missed opportunity. You have this opportunity of basically sitting someone down in front of a set of 100 ancient Egyptian flashcards and them going through those flashcards for 80 hours straight. Why wouldn't you make sure that the information in them is correct? Some things could be done better, for sure.
Yeah, and so this kind of segues perfectly into, with trying to improve and get things to a place where they may be, if not 100%, but more accurate. So I know that Ubisoft has this project called the Hieroglyphics Initiative, that they're kind of touting as a way to digitize and bring texts to a broader audience, and I'm assuming in a more accurate way. I was thinking about this because I know your work with looking at texts. Is this initiative, is it something that hopefully not only will it help scholars when they're kind of looking at more material, do you envision this as something that could eventually also go out and be looked at and become popular with like other people who maybe aren't in the field, just because it's available?
I think both. I actually think it has a greater utility for non-specialists. Well, that I don't know. So the Hieroglyphics Initiative, Ubisoft contracted with a British software company called Cycle, out of, I forget the name of the place. But anyway, I consulted with them. Alex Fry was the head of the project, and it's his company. And I went and stayed with him for a couple days a few years ago, when I happened to be traveling like from Scotland to Belgium. So I like rented a car and went and visited him, and we talked about the project and all this stuff. Really fun time. He has a beautiful house in the English countryside. So it was, and a lovely family and all those things. So Alex, if you're listening to this, I had a wonderful time, and thanks for having me. And what he was trying to work on was an easier way of Egyptologists taking texts and taking like images of texts and converting them into actual digital text. So that's a bit of an abstract thing. You kind of have to be fairly computer savvy to understand what the actual function of that is. But if you have a photograph of an Egyptian text, that can't be used except to be looked at, right? It's just it's a series of colored pixels. There's no actual text there in order to use it to say, study the frequency of certain verb forms in actual Egyptian text. You have to convert it to digitized text, which means you have to actually like have a computer program that reads the signs in the image and converts them into some sort of encoded representation of the Egyptian script. And that's what he was working on. That's something that I've worked on in my own research for a long time. I think that's how he and I ended up chatting so much about these things. And the tools they made were super useful. So they made a tool for taking something like a sort of low quality image and cleaning it up and extracting all the different glyph shapes so that a computer program could more accurately convert it into Egyptian text. So that would be really useful for scholars. I know the front end version of the project that Google just made public, it has all kinds of like quizzes and little activities. I say little in the sense of they are short. They have like, it's like a 10-question quiz and you learn like 5 Egyptian hieroglyphs. I think those are great for introducing people to the subject. If nothing else, they will kind of reify the script as something that can be just read and understood in the same way that if you look at English or Cyrillic or, Tamil or Chinese or Japanese or any kind of like written script, whether you know it or not, you immediately appreciate that it is writing. I think that's always the biggest hurdle with new students, is convincing them that this is not picture writing. These are not just, it's not like man go house and like a man and an arrow and a house. It's the Egyptian language represented in script, just like written English is the English language represented phonetically with script. So it's huge for that, and it's huge for taking it from something that's just kind of like you see in movies and turning it into something that you can like pick up a book and learn. That was the transformation for me as an undergrad at UT, was seeing that there was a book called Egyptian Grammar, where there were vocabulary lists that had pictures of like owls and ducks and stuff in them. It makes it a real thing that you can learn. I think that's the most important contribution.
Yeah, and I think, I'm really excited to see what it becomes when it's finally done, because I believe they're still working on it currently. But yeah, I'm very curious to see what it'll look like, and yeah. And so I was thinking, but something like that initiative obviously it's happening in large part because Ubisoft decided, hey, this is something we think would be worthwhile, but also recognizing that they are a giant gaming company who makes millions of dollars because people love games. Billions of dollars. So they have the funding to be able to put toward this project. But there generally otherwise seems to be really big issues with funding the humanities, because in this day and age, it just seems like no one really cares to fund people to study these really old, archaic things. And I find that to be such an issue, just because a lot of times I talk to people and I'm like, but do you realize how much it's good for people to have a background in the humanities, to be able to take that and go into other things? Just because you major in any of the ancient disciplines doesn't mean you have to go into the field. I'm living, breathing proof of that. I was a classics major, but I'm not about to go into it at the grad level. So, it's just interesting to me how the big push is towards STEM fields and other things. I had a friend who really loves Egyptology as much as I do. And he said, my parents told me I absolutely 100% could not go and study that because I will never get a job, never be employed. It is not useful. There are no useful skills.
His parents were right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, as an academic who actually went into the field, do you feel that your research is so niche that like this was the only way you could go, or do you feel like you did actually also get things where you could go into something else if you couldn't get a job in Egyptology?
In my case, I could, just because I've also done so much math and coding, because my language research relies on like computational analysis of ancient Egyptian texts. So that's just any academic is going to be sort of synthesizing multiple fields. It happens in my case that the field that I am synthesizing with, Egyptology, is one that is highly in demand in other areas. So I just happen to be fortunate in that regard. I studied computer science growing up, and I always loved it. And then I brought it into my study of ancient languages just because it was a thing that I'd been doing since I was like 13 or 14. I'd been learning about computers and coding, so it just made sense. So in my case, I'm just coincidentally fortunate. I think in many cases, people are not so fortunate, and it's a tragic thing. I think it ultimately goes back to some short-sighted, selfish decisions by professional academics dating all the way back to the sort of post-war era, when there was all kinds of funding because basically, math and science and education saved the world from fascism. And I, it's a simplification, but I think it's still literally true. Education does save us from fascism, and it has before. But then a lot of people in the post-war era, the US government was funding universities really heavily. And a lot of people started asking this question of like, how do we measure the value of the humanities? And then I think because, it was the most pro-capitalist society you'll ever find, the inclination was to find a capitalistic explanation for why the humanities are valuable. And capitalism, by its nature, demands that you be able to translate everything into a dollar metric of some sort. Something, in order to have value, the value must be convertible into money, into dollars. And that's simply not true in real life. And we know it's not true, of course. No sane person would, sell one of their children or something. We intuitively recognize that there are things that are valuable that simply cannot be measured in terms of dollars. But I think a lot of thinkers and public intellectuals at the time, instead of kind of standing up and boldly saying like, this is not a capitalistic enterprise, it cannot be measured in those terms, and you will ruin it if you try to do so because it's inapplicable. Instead, they tried to find clever ways of measuring the value of the humanities in terms of dollars. And those were lies. It's just not true. Humanities really have no monetary value whatsoever. They're valuable to us as human beings, and they are valuable to our souls, and our souls also have no monetary value. So it's just a complete mistaken way of seeing it. It's kind of a tragedy of the commons situation where it was individually beneficial to each person who made that argument, but then detrimental to the humanities as a whole in the long run. So yeah, we've just got to get out of that. And I think people need to boldly say, no, this does not have financial value. Whether or not Fortune 500 companies hire humanities PhDs because of their breadth of wisdom and experience is irrelevant to whether we should study these things. And I'm going to demand of you that you expand your understanding of value beyond financial value. And yeah, that's all there is to it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that, because this is, something that's priceless. People, they ask me about, oh, you majored in that. Okay, great for you. What are you going to do? How do you feel? Do you regret it? And I say, of course not. Of course I don't regret it. I wouldn't have wanted to do anything different. I love my major. I love having studied the classics. It makes me, I think, hopefully a better critical thinker and all the yada, yada, yada that comes with studying really academic, reading intensive topics.
In some way, it has enriched your life, right? And and I think, obviously you should answer the question whichever way you prefer, but if you answered the question to me that way, I would consider that a satisfactory answer. If you said, studying the classics has enriched my life, I would say that should be good enough for anyone. That means your life.
Yeah, and I think it's really sad that some people don't want to sort of recognize that, no matter what you say, some people are going to be unhappy is what I've found, or at least dissatisfied. But just to kind of wrap all this up, we well, at least in the US, are kind of a society that is very heavily based off of the Greco-Roman world and ideals. So not as much the ancient Near East. But, do you still see, certain veins of Egyptian, more than just symbolism, ideas, cultural, influences, beyond just the superficial, oh, look, that's a pyramid, we like pyramids, whatever. Do you see that kind of
Oh my
anywhere in our
gosh,
country?
so much. I see it all the time, and maybe I'm just primed to see it, but instead of trying to like come up off the top of my head with a list of things that would almost certainly be woefully incomplete, I'll come up with an example. So Egyptian wisdom texts are pretty accessible. If you Google Egyptian wisdom texts, you'll probably find translations of them. The worldview expressed in these texts is remarkably comparable to the understanding of life that you'll find in like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and of course, Stoic thought and that kind of understanding of the world transferred to Europe, especially the United Kingdom, for whatever reason. That the whole British stiff upper lip mentality is rooted in Roman Stoicism, which is, I think, ultimately rooted in Greek philosophy and the original Stoics, and then which is itself rooted in Egyptian thinking about how to live life, and that's something that we've imported. If you watch any Western where there's a very quiet, pensive cowboy who can't change but does his best anyway, that is ancient Egyptian wisdom texts in our modern society, for sure.
That's really cool. Yeah, I believe that there's going to be so many different sort of influences from ancient Egypt that I see that I don't recognize, but I kind of have a suspicion, oh, there must be something here beyond the very, very in your face apparent. I'm pretty sure when I was watching, what was it? Oh goodness. Gods of Egypt, that so bad it's good film. I'm pretty sure I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was watching it and I said, oh, I think this, whatever a character was saying sounds really applicable to modern times. And I was like, oh, well, hey, look, that's not, I wish I remembered what that was. Whatever, maybe I'll go back and watch it.
Go take a look at it. There are lots of those. There's so many examples like that.
And it's funny that I seem to find that there are more movies with sort of an Egyptian flavor that just can't even be called anything near accurate or good. They just sort of incorporate Egypt into them, but we love them anyway.
Yeah. Cheesecake Factory, right? Like, so I used a very abstract example involving like philosophy and worldview, but like go to a Cheesecake Factory. It's clearly like Egyptomania in style. Why? What does Egypt have to do with cheesecakes? I don't know. We just like Egypt, it just shows up everywhere.
Yeah, very aesthetic. So in these last few minutes, I love the poem Ozymandias. It's what I've named my podcast after. And I think that it's my favorite poem of all time because I think the mark of a good poem is that it can be applicable at any point in time. It doesn't matter when it was written, if you can still kind of think about it and use it now. You're like, oh, that's a great poem. So I love to have all my guests read the poem and then just sort of give me, your thoughts on what it means. What is it? Does it speak to you in any way?
Okay. Yeah. So let me see. I might mess it up because I'm just going to go from memory, but we'll see how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. So yeah, that's a cool poem. I love it so much. If I missed a line in there, I apologize. But
No,
so
I actually was like, wow, it's really ingrained in there because that was perfect. Yeah.
it was a spot on. Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Well
spot
done,
on.
Christian. So I think my favorite thing, I have so many favorite things about that poem. One of the things that I really love about it is the meter. So the meter and rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme is fairly complex. I don't have it in front of me, but it's like A, B, A, C, D, A, B, D, C. Like it's a really like interwoven rhyme scheme, which is pretty cool. The way the meter is sort of tweaked a little bit. So it's written in iambic tetrameter, I think, but then there are places where the where like the first foot is a trochee. So I'm getting way too much into meter, but like there are places where the line sort of goes like up, down, and kind of does this kind of like bunting type metrical thing where it's like up and down. And there are lines that sort of start on an unstressed syllable and then bounce up and down. And that perfectly mirrors the mood of what the lines are saying. So if something's sort of like left hanging and incomplete, the meter like conveys that perfectly, just the way we would in normal speech. So I love how well technically crafted that poem is. In terms of content, there's so much good stuff in there. Probably my favorite element is the King of Kings, because that is an actual common Afroasiatic way of expressing the superlative. So Egyptian actually doesn't have comparative and superlative adjectives. So you can't say that something is good, better, and best. You just say something is good with respect to other things, and that means it's better than other things. Or you say that something is a good, the good of the good ones, right? So it's like, among the good things, it's even gooder than the good things. So it's the best. And King of Kings is one such phrase. So it actually mirrors Egyptian grammar. And of course, we know about it in English via translations of the Hebrew Bible. But that's actually not a native English construction. That is an Afroasiatic construction. So those little linguistic elements are just awesome, obviously. Like it's just, there's little Easter eggs in there for a linguist. I think the sense of elegant decay, kind of the lost ancient civilization, it's so well conveyed in that poem. And I think any Egyptologist would be lying if they didn't admit that that's part of the appeal, right? This notion of this mysterious lost world where it's just like the decaying remains of stone palaces and temples and things. It's never stops being fascinating. And then there was one last thing I was going to say about it. What was it? Oh, I was going to mention the Dender temple in the Met. There's this like broken statue inside of it, which just makes no sense. I even asked one of the curators I know, why in the world is that statue in there? Like, it's not a temple statue. It doesn't belong there. It's broken in half. And that is probably the reasoning that, so if you go to the Met and you go inside the temple, there's like a half broken statue in there. That is the poem Ozymandias being realized in a museum display. It has no historical reference whatsoever. It's just this feeling of elegant decay that we just love and deliberately seek out.
Yeah, and so I'm really excited to ask this, just because you're the first Egyptologist I've been able to get on the podcast. Does it change anything for you to read this knowing that while it's called Ozymandias, that's just the Greekified name of Ramesses? Does it change anything knowing, it's actually a pharaoh, while a classicist might read it and say, yeah, well, I know who he is, but I'm looking at it from a more classical perspective?
So the thing that stands out for me about that is that his name was something like Ozymandias. So the praenomen of the pharaoh was the one that was actually used. The nomen is the one that we use in modern times, and we append the numbers to it. So like Ramses II is Ozymandias. his name as pharaoh, so his formal name was Ozymandias. That's presumably how people would have referred to him at the time. That's how texts refer to him. And the vocalization at that time probably would have been something quite like Ozymandias. Let's see, it would be Ozymeire. So it's pretty darn close. It's closer than Usur Ma'atre or Usur Ma'atra, which is how Egyptologists would traditionally, according to modern scholarly conventions, would read that name. So yeah, that's the thing that sticks out to me about it, is that we're actually kind of pronouncing his name correctly because knowledge of that name got passed down, which didn't always happen, of course. In terms of reading it from an Egyptian versus classical perspective, I think there is a notion of Egypt as a sort of a failed civilization that is born from a colonial worldview. Egypt has been colonized repeatedly, starting with the Macedonian Greeks, then the Romans, and then the Arabs, of course, and then the Ottomans, just several different caliphates, and then the Ottomans. And then, of course, the French and the British, and all the way up until independence. And even today, it's still not, Egypt is not totally free. It doesn't have free and fair elections and all those kinds of things. And then the US propped up Mubarak's dictatorship, right? So Egypt has basically been colonized since 332 BC. And a big part of that, of the pro-colonialist propaganda, is treating Egypt as this kind of dead civilization, this failed eternal civilization. And that supports a colonialist agenda, which says we need to go in there and fix everything up and make it great again, which is, I said it before and I caught myself saying it, but it's what I mean to say. It's this narrative of, the antebellum South or any other place in history where kind of people have an agenda. They will use this kind of lost cause, failed civilization imagery to justify it. And that's in the poem Ozymandias a little bit. I don't see it as being central to the poem's appeal, so it doesn't. For me, the poem itself is not necessarily problematic, but yeah, that's definitely in there.
Yeah, no, I do love the different take, and I was really, really excited to be able to finally ask an Egyptologist about the poem from their perspective, because reading it for me, sometimes I just read it and I think, oh, this is such a memento mori over here. Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
What a time to read it and be alive. So the last thing that I want to do really quickly here is ask you kind of a fun question, because we've been talking about a lot of really sort of deep, super scholarly, interesting things that I do love. But this one is kind of just a really softball question to have some fun at the end. What if there were 3 mythological people from Egyptian mythology that you would like to sort of meet and have a conversation with? Who would you choose and why?
So the mythological, they can't have been real living people at any time?
Oh, I suppose you know what? Let's make it who, real life or mythological.
Real life or mythological. So Amun would be my first choice, because he is my favorite Egyptian deity. And then Anup or Anubis, also one of my favorites. I would love to meet both of them, and Hathor. Actually, I'm just going to choose 3 deities, because that, since I'm getting to choose, I would definitely pick 3 deities. If I had to choose real people, I'm going to say, just for the sake of argument, that I have to choose real people. Let's see. Probably Pia or Pianki would be one of my first choices. He's a Nubian ruler who invaded Egypt and left a description of his invasion, and he just seems like a super interesting guy to me. I would probably want to meet someone really old, like Narmer, assuming that he was an actual living person. I would love to meet him and just find out what his world is like. And then because I'm just such a language nerd, I would probably pick Setnachamos, who was the 4th son of Ramses the Great. because he would go around and like restore them. So I would want to record everything he says so I could have the, and I would also just like to talk to him, his life experience. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think those are all really, really fun choices. I love this question because for me, it's very singular. I have found when people ask me all the time that
Oh yeah.
oh, who from history would you want to talk to? Blah blah blah. My answer is I find always, always, always going to be Akhenaten because I have always been obsessed with the Amarna period and everything with it.
He creeps me out so much. Oh my gosh.
The architecture part, or just like he was insane?
I think he was totally insane. I think we have enough evidence to confidently say that he was literally an insane person. It's always problematic when you're looking so far back in history. And I'm saying that is problematic just to be sure anyone listening to this should not take this and take it to mean that Akhenaten was definitely insane. But I feel like the balance of the evidence does suggest that. I think it's fair to say that he was probably totally insane. So yeah, it'd be interesting to meet him for sure.
Yeah, I just want to know, what was going on in that brain of his. The questions we all want to ask, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you so much though for coming on the podcast. It was a real treat to be able to speak with you today, and just have at it and chat and whatnot.
Thank you so much, Lexie. It was wonderful to be here.
Fun.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient Odyssey. Next stop is Present Ponderings. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.